12 days. That is the countdown making the rounds everywhere right now, on YouTube, on Telegram, in group chats, and in comment sections. The rumor says that in less than 2 weeks, World War III will start. Nuclear threats will finally become reality, and the world as we know it could collapse overnight. But is this really true? Or just the latest wave of viral panic? Another cycle of fear that comes and goes with every headline? Tonight, we go deep into where these rumors start, how they spread, and, most importantly, how to spot the difference between real escalation and manufactured hype. In this update, we will break down exactly where the 12 days rumor really came from, what is actually being said by leaders like Trump, Putin, and top military officials, and what is really happening with the so-called nuclear threats and the border incidents on NATO's eastern flank. You will see how and why viral countdowns explode across the internet. And most important, I will show you the real escalation signals that top analysts and intelligence services are watching right now, not just the dramatic headlines. By the end, you will have a simple method to break the panic cycle the next time a viral deadline starts spreading. Stick around, because this could save you from a lot of unnecessary stress the next time the internet goes into crisis mode. Let's start with the facts. On July 28th, Donald Trump made international headlines by dramatically shifting his approach to the war in Ukraine. Instead of maintaining a vague or distant timeline for peace negotiations, Trump publicly declared that Russia now has just 10 to 12 days to make concrete progress toward a ceasefire or face a fresh round of severe U.S. sanctions and trade tariffs. These measures would focus especially on energy flows, oil, gas, and critical exports, while also targeting key international trade routes that fuel the Russian economy. Reuters reported the statement almost immediately, quoting Trump as saying, "The previous deadline of 50 days is now reduced to 10 or 12 days. If Russia does not act, the U.S. will increase economic pressure dramatically." What's important here is that this is not a backroom diplomatic leak or a rumor, but a deliberate message broadcast for maximum visibility, designed to pressure both Russia and America's allies into action. Within hours, major news organizations and wire services ran with the story, but what happened next is a perfect example of how a political announcement turns into viral panic. Dozens of YouTube channels, Telegram groups, and social feeds took Trump's statement and amplified it, stripping away the context and turning a complex negotiation tactic into a ticking clock for World War III. Thumbnails flashed in red, alert, and 12 days left. And as usual, the countdown narrative began to snowball, feeding off the natural anxiety of a global audience already on edge. In just one day, the phrase 12 days became one of the top trending topics in geopolitics, with millions of views and countless reposts, all speculating about what might happen on day zero. But as so often happens, the online conversation quickly detached from the reality of the diplomatic situation and took on a life of its own. So, what actually happened after Trump's statement? The Kremlin's official spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, told reporters that Moscow had taken note of Trump's new deadline, but offered no concrete response or sign of immediate concern. Rather than escalating, the official line was carefully non-committal, leaving plenty of room for maneuver. But it did not end there. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, known for his sharp rhetoric, took to X to brand Trump's move as a dangerous ultimatum game. Medvedev warned that framing international crises as countdowns or ultimatums is a strategy that historically risks backfiring, potentially leading not to negotiation but to direct confrontation between nuclear powers. His comments were picked up by outlets like the BBC and The Independent, who highlighted how the Russian leadership used Trump's announcement as an opportunity to reinforce its hardline position, yet crucially, they stopped short of issuing threats of immediate military escalation or nuclear response. This is the reality behind the viral countdown. There is a real political deadline in play, but it is being used as leverage, as part of the ongoing diplomatic chess match, not as a direct trigger for military action. This kind of public deadline is a classic tool in high-stakes negotiations, meant to increase pressure, shape the media narrative, and try to force the other side's hand without actually crossing a line that would spark immediate conflict. Throughout history, Such deadlines have been used by both superpowers, but they are rarely followed by instant action. Instead, they often serve as milestones to test intentions, force talks, or set up a new round of behind-the-scenes bargaining. So when you see a headline or video that claims the world will change in 12 days, remember that this is not a declaration of war or a concrete plan for nuclear conflict. It's a tactical move in a much longer and more complicated game, one that unfolds in phases, not with a single dramatic countdown. So what does this deadline actually mean for the risk of escalation? According to official sources like Reuters, BBC, and Defense One, Trump's statement is part of a broader U.S. strategy to push Russia back to the negotiating table, not a countdown to military conflict. On the ground, the war in Ukraine continues with intense fighting along multiple fronts. In the past week, there have been new Russian missile strikes against Ukrainian cities, as well as Ukrainian drone attacks targeting Russian infrastructure in the Black Sea region. Meanwhile, a Russian military drone briefly violated Lithuanian airspace, triggering a rapid response from NATO jets, as reported by Reuters and the Scottish Sun. Defense One analyzed the incident, confirming that while these airspace violations are serious, they are typically resolved through rapid military and diplomatic communication and do not automatically lead to direct confrontation. On the American side, President Biden and top Pentagon officials have made it clear that the U.S. will continue to support Ukraine with military aid, intelligence, and economic sanctions, but there is no intention of seeking direct war with Russia. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte reiterated this week, as covered by BBC and Defense One, that the alliance is doing everything possible to avoid miscalculation, maintain open communication channels, and prevent any incident from spiraling out of control. These are not just talking points. Since the start of the war, NATO has made its deployments and exercises as transparent as possible, even inviting observers and publishing schedules to avoid misunderstandings. The reality is that as tense as things are, there is no sudden movement of U.S. or NATO troops, no hidden military buildup, and no signs that either side is preparing for an imminent clash. A classic example of how facts get twisted is the rumor that the U.S. is urgently moving nuclear bombs into Europe in response to the latest crisis. In reality, as both BBC and Foreign Affairs have confirmed, the modernization of the U.S. nuclear arsenal in Europe is a long-term process that began years ago and is not a reaction to any new event. Likewise, Russia's periodic movement of nuclear-capable missiles in Kaliningrad has been happening for months, but open-source analysts and satellite imagery show no sudden increase in readiness or changes in nuclear posture. What we are seeing, experts say, is a case of escalation by rhetoric, words and political signals used to increase psychological pressure, not to change the military balance overnight. But this is where it gets tricky. Because these stories are so dramatic, they get picked up, repackaged, and recycled across social media, making every exercise, every statement, and every incident look like a sign of imminent disaster. And yet, as top analysts at Foreign Affairs note, real escalation is never a single countdown. It is always a process, a pattern of moves and countermoves, not a single deadline. But this is not the only signal to watch this week. Coming up, I will show you the actual escalation patterns that matter according to the world's top analysts, and what is just another round of viral panic. Let's stop and ask why countdowns like 12 days left spread so quickly. There are three main reasons. First, countdowns trigger a sense of urgency and anxiety. A ticking clock makes people feel they have to act now, even if there is no real evidence to support the claim. Psychologists at the Oxford Internet Institute and the Atlantic Council have shown that fear-based messages with a clear deadline get shared much more widely than ordinary news, especially on YouTube, Telegram, and X. Second, countdowns are simple and memorable. They fit perfectly into thumbnails, titles, and short videos, driving up clicks and watch time for creators who use them. Third, we are living in a time of real anxiety, with people worried about rising prices, international instability, and the potential for global crisis. In that environment, any message promising the real date or the final warning will always find an audience. But here is the real danger. Viral countdowns and fear-based headlines distract us from the signals that actually matter. As one analyst from Foreign Affairs put it, while everyone is watching the clock, the real risks often develop quietly, outside the headlines. Have you seen these last chance headlines in your own feed? Where did you spot them first? Drop it in the comments. Sometimes how a rumor spreads tells us more about public anxiety than about the facts on the ground. But countdowns are not how escalation works in the real world. Let's look at the signals that top intelligence agencies actually monitor when they are watching for escalation. If you want to know how escalation really works, forget viral deadlines and watch for 3 key signals. First, pay attention to sudden and unexplained changes in military posture. This means large-scale mobilizations, surprise troop movements, or the transfer of strategic assets like nuclear warheads or missile systems. These changes are almost always noticed by independent analysts and open-source intelligence groups who monitor everything from satellite images to rail traffic. Reuters, BBC, and Defense One have all reported that as of today, there are no unusual mobilizations on the Russian or NATO side that would signal immediate preparation for war. Second, listen for coordinated changes in diplomatic communication. When multiple governments begin issuing warnings, recalling diplomats, or advising citizens to leave certain regions, it is a sign that a crisis may be approaching. For example, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there were clear, repeated warnings from US and European leaders, and embassies quietly evacuated staff. According to the Council on Foreign Relations in Nikkei Asia, no such coordinated warnings are happening now, even though tensions are high. Third, look for major disruptions in information channels. When governments suddenly go silent, restrict media access, or cut off communication with other countries, it often means that something bigger is happening behind the scenes. These disruptions are usually the last warning before a major escalation. So if you see 3 things, a surge in unexplained military movement, a wave of coordinated diplomatic warnings, and a blackout in information, then it is time to pay close attention. But right now, none of these red flags are flashing. There is also one more indicator that rarely makes the news but can be important: the movement of high-profile civilians or assets. When oligarchs, diplomats, or government officials start quietly moving families or money out of a region, it can sometimes signal that they expect trouble. Reports show some Russian elites have been shifting assets abroad since the war began, but this is not a new phenomenon and does not point to a sudden crisis. But what about nuclear threats? That is the question that gets the most attention. And up next, we will break down exactly how real this risk is and what is just psychological warfare. Now let's talk about the big fear: nuclear threats and the supposed normalization of talking about nuclear war. The truth is, nuclear rhetoric has been part of Moscow's psychological strategy for decades. The Kremlin, especially figures like Medvedev, regularly invokes the nuclear option to send signals to Western leaders and reassure their own domestic audience. This does not mean Russia is preparing for nuclear war right now. Defense One and Nikkei Asia both report that while the risk of nuclear escalation is never zero, there are multiple layers of command, control, and early warning systems on all sides designed to prevent accidental use. There is no credible sign from satellite imagery, intelligence leaks, or diplomatic signals that nuclear weapons are being readied for immediate use. The reason nuclear talk feels more common today is that it is echoed and amplified by both state media and independent creators looking for engagement. As Nikkei Asia reported, the more nuclear threats are discussed, the more they become part of the background noise, making it harder for people to tell the difference between real escalation and psychological games. For viewers in the US and Europe, the real takeaway is that both sides have strong reasons to avoid any move toward nuclear exchange, which would be catastrophic for everyone. The hype around nuclear countdowns is about generating fear, not reflecting reality. So what should you do when you see another nuclear deadline trending online? The answer is simple. Check for the real signals, military, diplomatic, or civilian movement, as we discussed, and cross-check with trusted sources. Remember, psychological pressure is a tool that both sides use, especially when the news cycle is heating up. Let's pause and think about what all this means. If every week seems to bring a new crisis, a new countdown, or a new threat, how do you keep your focus and avoid getting swept up in the fear? After years of tracking these stories, I have learned that the loudest headlines are rarely the most accurate. It is easy to feel overwhelmed when every update is urgent and every feed is a flood of breaking news. But the real skill, the one we build together here in the safety zone, is learning to spot the difference between real patterns and just another cycle of panic. That means slowing down, comparing sources, waiting for details behind the headline, and focusing on signals, not just noise. Have you ever changed your plans or felt real anxiety because of a viral headline or a countdown that never came true? How do you decide what to believe when the news cycle is spinning out of control? Let's talk in the comments and help each other build smarter, stronger habits for the next wave of rumors. If you are still watching, you are not just chasing the next big headline. You are here for context, for real analysis, and for a community that values clarity over panic. Subscribe for updates that go beyond the hype and countdowns. Share your experiences and your questions in the comments. Your story might help someone else break the cycle of panic. The more we talk about what is real, the stronger our community becomes. In a world full of viral deadlines and manufactured fear, the best defense is understanding the real signals before they turn into the next breaking story. Stay sharp, Safety Zone.